Thank you very much. We are thrilled to have members of our SDSU coming on stage to help us for this presentation. Here, coming a little early before the performances today, we're looking forward to having an opportunity to talk with you about some. Today's session is wide-ranging, lots of topics to discuss. So we're going to talk about hearing conservation, the hearing. The way your ears process sound is incredibly important for musicians, to state the obvious. I want to convince you of that. I want to give you some evidence that will help convince you even more of that. We're going to talk a little bit about music psychology. You're going to hear the perspective of a psychologist and of a cognitive psychologist and also of an audiologist related to what happens when sound energy is vibrating in the environment and what happens as we process that as music in our brains. And then how does the psychology of music affect not only musicians, but audience members who are engaged in this process? All right, next slide, thank you. All right, I would like to start off this learning experience by creating a little cognitive dissonance. That's like what I like to do in my classes. Give you something that will make you question kind of what you're doing. So I'd like to present for you a musical illusion. And before we have our awesome performers play, you're going to hear another sound right now. I hope. All right, thank you. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm going to actually ask her to hit the back button a couple of times. And I'm going to have that again, and I'm going to ask them to bring the sound way down, and I'm going to ask you to hum the melody that you're hearing. Okay, hum the melody with me. Play it one more time, please. Hear that? Oh, good, stop it. You did it. Do you hear that? Da, 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 da. Is that what you heard? Yep. Now, what I'm going to do is ask our performers to play it. That was a full orchestra. What you're going to hear now is violin 1 and violin 2 playing exactly the excerpt that you just heard, and you'll hear the whole piece later this evening. Did you hear the same melody? Same melody? All right, let me ask the first violins to play their part. Okay, first violins only. Second violins, would you play your part? Now play them together, just that one phrase, just the one phrase. Did anybody hear bom, bee, bom, 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 bom? Or did you go back to the original melody you heard the first time? First time? Yeah. What happened is, next slide, what happened is Tchaikovsky wrote the music like the left side of the page, but our brains say, nah, that couldn't be happening on this stage. So it takes the first note of the second violin part, the second note of the first violin part, etc., and says, these melodies make a lot more sense. So your brain takes over and says, this that's happening out in the real world doesn't make sense. Here's what Tchaikovsky really meant. We're going to do one last thing before we move on, and I'm going to ask the first violinist to go on one side of the stage, second violinist on the other side of the stage, and they're going to be playing the same parts, and my question for you is, do you hear the jumping angular part, or do you hear that smooth ascending melody. Whenever you're ready, maestro. Thank you very much. Would you put your hands together for our performers? What did Tchaikovsky have in mind? We have a panel, next slide please. We have a panel discussion to address what is going on in music psychology. You will hear first from Laura Getz, who is from the University of San Diego. You will then hear from Peter Torre, who's from San Diego State University. And then we'll have Sarah Creel from UC San Diego talking to us. Laura.
All right, hello everyone. I'm excited to share some of my lab's research with you, including both why protecting your hearing is important and how context shows that perception, attention, and memory are creating these types of illusions all the time. So next slide. I want to start by thanking my wonderful research assistants in the Language and Music Perception Lab. USD is only an undergraduate institution, so these are all undergrads working in my lab and helping with my research. So I'm generally interested in the role of interactions in helping us understand auditory perception. So although auditory perception is often studied one modality at a time, in my work, I show the importance of interactions between sensory information received in different modalities. So for example, how auditory and visual information integrate, as well as how that sensory information interacts with higher levels of processing, with cognitive processes like prior knowledge influencing auditory perception. And typically in my lab, we perform experiments where we manipulate at least one variable to see the effects on perception, attention, or memory outcomes. And so I'm going to give you 3 brief examples, then tie them all together. So in the first example, looking at complex rhythm perception or syncopation perception, our question was, do genres matter in determining who is an expert in rhythm performance? Or whether, because you're a musician, are all musicians always better than non-musicians if it's a rhythm-related task? And we use Latin salsa music as a test case here because there are highly standardized rhythm patterns that have strong structural conventions. So the clave pattern, the instrument shown up there, is the key to tying all of the different parts together. So what we did was we chose some real clave patterns that are actually used in salsa music, some other syncopated patterns that aren't usually used in salsa music but are still complex patterns, and then some simple manipulated alternatives that are never used in salsa music. And we played these different versions of it and asked people to pick out which one makes the most sense, which one matches the music that you're listening to with the rest of the parts. And in the first group here, you can see that those who had low familiarity with salsa music, so this is both non-musicians and musicians, pretty much any pattern you gave them, they say, sure, that sounds fine. The next group, the people who are high familiar novices, these would be people who maybe have danced salsa music before or who grew up listening to salsa music. They know that syncopated patterns are important, but don't necessarily choose the right syncopated pattern. So it's only the highly familiar musicians who not only choose the syncopated pattern, but actually get the correct pattern when you play a variety of patterns for them. So in answering the research question, it seems like yes, genres do matter. Your prior knowledge, in this case about genres, actually influences how you perceive and interpret music, which shows that our brains are wired based on our prior experiences. In the next example, I want to give you move away from just music perception to how features of music, like a fast versus a slow tempo, or the instruments that are playing, can influence perception of advertised products. So in this example, we played people radio advertisements for a brand of sneakers or for a laptop. And during the sneaker commercial, the background music was either fast or slow. And during the laptop commercial, the same song was played either on a trombone or on a flute. And afterwards, we asked people how fast they thought the sneakers could help them run and how durable the laptop was. In our first experiment, we found there were no differences between tempos or the instruments when we didn't highlight the background music for the participants. But in experiments 2 and 3, we called people's attention to the music in various ways during the advertisements. And then we found that people who listened to the fast version of the music, shown here in green, actually thought that the sneakers would make them run faster than the people who listened to the slow version of the music. And those who heard the trombone music, here in gold, rated the laptop as more durable than the flute version. So this is another type of trick or illusion showing that specific attention to the features of music can change your perception of the advertised products, showing how our brain, again, is making sense of the information based on previous patterns and knowledge about musical features. So our perception is a constant construction rather than being only based on the auditory input that we're receiving. And then in a final example, we are looking at how music serves as an aid to memory performance. So we often use music to help us remember information. From the time you're young, you can think of the ABCs, or maybe you learned the 50 Nifty United States song. But there's actually less empirical evidence showing that music helps memory in the short term. So in our experiment, we played people lists of random 2-syllable words that were either positive, neutral, or negative in valence. And these lists, they either heard it spoken, just one word after the other. They heard it sung to an unfamiliar melody, which we took from an intro sight singing book, or a familiar melody like Yankee Doodle or Old MacDonald Had a Farm. And then the final condition, we played piano versions of the song first and made sure that the people were highly familiar with the song before they did the memory task. So then participants afterwards were asked to freely recall any of the words they could remember from the list in any order. And it turns out that the music actually made it more difficult to remember the words. So you could see up here that the speech condition all across was the best, followed by the unfamiliar melody, and then the familiar melody was actually the worst, whether or not you pointed out to them what the melody was. So at least in the short term, this shows that the belief that music always aids our memory might not be true. And this relates back to this big idea that prior knowledge, how your brain is always making use of context, and memory is also a construction, not just of the actual information, but how you process and interpret that information in light of your prior knowledge. So in all of these examples, again, this comes back to my key research question of trying to understand auditory perception in relation to interactions across modalities and between levels of processing. And my work shows how perception, attention, and memory are all constructions of our prior knowledge and experience rather than following in a straightforward way based only on the input. And I want to end by saying that none of these effects would work. The same with damaged hearing, right? Relating back to this idea that hearing conservation is important because the bottom-up sensory input from your auditory system of turning these mechanical vibrations in the air into electrical signals that your brain is interpreting needs to interact with these top-down cognitive information in order for a perception to take place. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Peter Torre. I am the lab manager, or actually I'm the researcher in charge of recreational noise exposure. And I look at things from the periphery. So my job is to evaluate how the cochlea, the inner ear, reacts to all these sounds we're bombarded with all day. Next slide, please. So basically, we've done a couple things historically in the lab. We were looking at primarily how earphone use, especially now with AirPods and the ubiquity of having everybody's got earphones, thankfully, except for not now, but you walk around mostly with music or anything, podcast, very close to your eardrum, which can cause problems. So one of our first studies is we were looking at, can we get a subjective evaluation of those measures and then actually get an objective measure of how loud people are actually listening to that. So we did a really cool study where we simply asked people, how loud do you listen to it? Because again, going back to my colleagues' research, right? If you go to any type of aerobic course, class in a gym or something, what is the music like? Jacked up, super loud to get you motivated, right? That's an important consideration. Can you have calm music while you're working out? Can you have like a nice babbling brook? No, see, I got no's from the panelists, so I'm guessing that's not the case. So we wanted to see how loud are people actually listening when they say they're listening loud. But the idea is, in the second bullet point, is we're trying to figure out what happens to the cochlea, something that you would never notice. So the physiology underlying the damage in advance of trying to see people saying that I feel I have a hearing loss, right? So the idea of, can we get to it before it turns into a permanent hearing loss? And that's sort of the goal of my lab. And now with Dr. Scott Lipscomb, we're transitioning a little bit, looking at student musicians, how well their hearing is, and what impact both some of their practice environments are, and maybe some of their off-campus settings are, how much that might impact their auditory function. Next slide, please. So, real quickly, the beauty of this device is that we simply rest a little probe assembly in your ear, and I can measure how well the hair cells within the cochlea actually respond to an external sound. You would never be able to do this on your own, you would never notice it, but it's a real fantastic measure for looking at this underlying subclinical function within the cochlea. The person simply sits there, we hit a button on a laptop, and we're done. 2 minutes each ear, thanks for stopping by. Next slide, please. Going backwards a little bit, this is from our study from, I think, 2008. But basically what we did was, again, recruit young adults right on the SDSU campus, giving them a question saying, do you prefer to listen to your volume low or medium, or loud or very loud? And we categorized those two groups. Then we did a different measure where we asked them, can you easily hear people around you? Do you have a little trouble hearing them? Can you have a lot of trouble, or can you not hear them at all? We categorized them sort of as the low risk versus high risk, if you will. And you can see, sadly, for the fellas, we win for all the wrong reasons in this case. All right, and then what we did was we have actually a piece of technology where I can put a probe microphone. It's basically like a little straw that I can put in your ear and have you say, okay, turn the volume up to how you want to listen to it. And that's the number down here. So you can see the mean 73 for everybody, 71, 72-ish, and 76.5 for men. Those are mean values. The great news is this is a quiet environment, so that's not hazardous. It just means that, you can do this, it's, again, in a quiet environment. Those aren't hazardous numbers, but once again, here's what I'd like to point out is our maximum numbers, just for our rock stars, 97.5 or 93, that's actually dangerous. Okay, I'm not gonna scare anybody, but that's the idea is if you listen at 97 dB, that's the equivalent of standing very close to, actually, not a jet engine, but maybe like pretty close to it. It's not very good. You can only sit in that environment for 3 or 4 minutes before possible damage can occur. Next slide, please. So we were curious about how different types of earphones affected the frequencies that are specifically getting to the ear, possibly causing damage. And the moral of the story, everyone, is you see this peak around 2,000 and 3,000 hertz. That I think is very informative because where we see what's called a typical noise-induced notch is an octave or half octave above that, stereotypically at 3,000 or 4,000 hertz in people's audiogram or their hearing test. So what you see is that these earphones are delivering that frequency range very close, because right, your earphones are right here, very close to the eardrum and being processed. So we're curious as to whether these long-term effects of this type of earphone use will cause more earlier onset noise-induced hearing loss. Next slide, please. The good news, we also did a follow-up study with respect to putting in people in a noise condition, and it was actually just 12-person background babble. Don't worry about that. The idea here is that the earbuds are the worst. Those are the stock ones we get with the phone, or if I go old school, the iPod. The cassette deck, if you want to go that old, okay? What we found was interesting. No surprise that in noise, everybody turned it up. That's, again, I'm not going to get a Nobel Prize for that. But what we did find is for the over-the-ear type Beats earphones, or over the circumaural we call them, there was very little difference in the quiet noise condition. Again, probably not surprising because it blocks the background noise and you may not have to turn it up that much. In fairness, though, we also didn't allow the participants to use noise canceling in this situation because we haven't studied the effects of noise canceling, but it would be likely that you would see that noise condition be similar to the quiet just because you're canceling out most of the background noise. Next slide, please. We did a study over the summer where some of my undergraduate researchers did some pre and post concert evaluations looking at those measures where you don't have to raise your hand, it's just the probe sits in the ear. And the moral of the story here is that you can see pre and post concert for the right ear and then pre and post concert for the left ear. The easiest thing, no big differences here. What this tells us is that for young adults with normal hearing, you have a very resilient cochlea. What happens is these post-concert measures were not done right after they came out of the Viejas Arena. What we did was we had to wait, unfortunately, the next day. So it was between 18 to 24 hours post-concert, but their inner hair cells were actually responding just the same as they did before the concert. So that's a good thing. Sadly, that goes away in time, okay? But let's not worry about that. Next slide, please. Yeah, like everything else. I hate to break it, yeah. We also, this is part of the discussion that I brought up earlier with Dr. Lipscomb and I. We've now been looking across various musicians. So we have our non-musicians, most likely speech language hearing majors that are in my classes. And then what we're studying is non-music major musicians and then music major musicians, looking to see is there a difference between those. So from the standpoint of, as a music major, are you, because you're practicing more, because you're in a practice room, are you exposing yourself to more of these sounds that potentially could cause damage? Once again, these are some early data. We only have 60 or so participants so far. This is part of our study that we're doing. The good news is all those kind of symbols roll over onto one another, and that's so far a good sign. Okay? Once again, the resiliency of the cochlea helps that part out too. Yeah. Next slide, please. So, going forward, what we're looking to do is, I did put that in italics, sorry. We are now starting a funded study where Dr. Lipscomb and I are recruiting student musicians where we test those measures to see how the cochlea is reacting right before they go into ensemble practice, and we actually do right now race them back to a room to do that measure again right after ensemble practice. The cool little thing too is we actually have one of my colleagues allows us to wear what's called a dosimeter, so they can actually measure how loud that setting is. So we can actually see it frequency by frequency to see what that person's exposed to and then possibly correlate it to any change we see between pre and post ensemble practice. So we're excited about that opportunity. We're also looking at what's called ultra high frequency. So your standard hearing test kind of ends at 8,000 hertz. We are going all the way up to 18,000 hertz, kind of in the dog whistle zone. Looking to see, is there better hearing for student musicians up in those higher frequencies? Because once again, it's their livelihood to know how to perceive those higher frequency stimuli. And lastly, there's a large literature out there with respect to professional musicians having better what we call speech and noise testing, where you can hear, you can decipher things in a complex listening environment, way different than this. This is a very simple environment for us. But we want to apply a speech and noise approach and actually get some measures of cognitive function to then see what piece of this puzzle is important to student musicians. Is it cognition? Is it auditory function? Is it something else? Is it a combination of the two? Next slide, please. And I would be remiss first without thanking our slide advance person, my wife, Megan. Coattails for nickname. And a shameless plug to our Instagram page. I'm old, so I don't run that. My students do. We also do a goofy how loud is it environment. We have sound level meters on our phones that all can measure how loud your environment is. It's goofy, but it actually is meaningful. So, and if you have any questions about the lab, feel free to email me. Thank you for your time.
Okay, it is as a former student musician, it feels sort of exciting to be here. I can feel the anticipation in the air. So I'm going to be talking to you about something that comes from the other side of my research. So I've been a professor at UCSD for, 17 years now. And I study both language processing and music processing. In particular, I study language development. And one thing that I tell my students in my language development classes all the time is perception precedes production, which is a nice alliterative slogan for something that happens. We could go ahead and advance slides. One more slide. Okay, so we know that, especially for little babies, you can test perception in little babies, it turns out. It takes very clever trickery, but you can do it. And we know from this that young infants can tell apart and identify a lot of sounds that they themselves cannot produce. There's some evidence that as early as 6 to 9 months of age, before kids are really producing any real words, they're babbling, but they are not. People think they're saying mama. They're not really saying mama. I'm so sorry. They're just saying ma, ma, ma. Vocal practice. Kids get good at talking by practice, just like musicians. And so they're not able to talk, but they do show some little bits of recognition of highly frequent words. Mama, dada, foods, body parts. They are able to recognize those even though they can't produce them. So they can perceive those sounds, they can comprehend those sounds even though they're not able to produce them. I'll tell you about, next slide. I'll tell you about a little bit of research from my own lab, not to mention the research I'm now doing in my own home with these two little naughty people right here. Only one of them actually needs an eye patch, the other one's just going along for the ride. So I'll leave you to guess which one. So with young children, one thing that you may have noticed is that young children, when they talk, they say things that are not quite like adults would say them. I've been doing research in this area long enough that I don't want to say they're making mistakes or that they're errors. They're just features of child speech. So a child might say wabbit instead of rabbit. And so the question is that how they think they're supposed to sound? We had this insight in my lab a few years ago that maybe we could ask this by testing whether children understand their own speech or how well they understand their own speech. So we took a bunch of pictures, showed the pictures to kids, had them label the pictures, had an adult also label the same pictures, and then we played them back to kids and we'd show them, say, 4 pictures at a time, and they'd hear themselves say something like, walk, or they'd hear the adult say, rock, and they had to point to which one they thought they were saying. And what I'm showing you here is an accuracy graph. Just the main thing I want you to notice here is that the left blue bar is a lot shorter than the right blue bar by about 0.15 or 15 percentage points. So a little kid is at about, on average, when you're 3 to 5 years old, you're about 75% correct at recognizing a word that you've said yourself, versus close to 100% if you heard that word produced by an adult. So the individual black spots, this is for sort of next level science nerds, those are individual participant scores. So there are some kids who I think are just really not getting what they're supposed to be doing or kind of goofing off. But what you can see is that there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of variability here. There are a few kids who understand themselves perfectly. But there are more kids who understand adults perfectly. And what that means is, again, children's perception of speech is more adult-like than their production of speech. And over several years, that will get much more adult-like as time goes on. We have some related projects looking at second language learners. And with second language learners, they actually understand themselves and a first language speaker about equally well. So they don't quite show that child pattern. We're digging into that a little more in an ongoing study that's taking place in my lab right now. So why don't we move on to the next slide? So the other kind of cool thing is that, perception, you do want perception to precede production because that's how a system works. If you have a motor system that has to produce these sounds, then you want to have the perception in place to guide your motor production. That's why, For instance, children who are born with extremely impaired hearing often don't start babbling. So babies who don't have any kind of, who need hearing correction and don't have it, do not babble, at least not with the frequency and not on the same time scale as infants who have intact hearing. And so we know that, I just want to let you know that even across the course of development, hearing does change. So you will lose some sensitivity at higher frequencies as you get older. I've definitely done that. I don't think I can hear anything above about 12,000 hertz at all. Those mosquito tones that are supposed to like keep teenagers away from convenience stores, I'm going right in that convenience store. Thank you very much. Gonna get my Gatorade. I was very terrified about 15 years ago when I realized I couldn't hear a lot of those. Anyway, even though you're losing some sensitivity at higher frequencies, adults, I found out, are a lot more sensitive to pitch changes, which means that you are a lot more sensitive to, you as a young adult or not so young adult, like me, are much more sensitive to pitch changes than a little kid. So if you play, for a kid, if you play something like da-dun, da-dun, and you say, were those the same or different? A lot of them will tell you they were the same. What do they think sounds different? Different musical instruments. So if you like play a muted trumpet like and a vibraphone, doom, doom, they'll say, yeah, those are different. But melody, yeah, and so that's borne out next to animation. What you'll notice in this right-hand graph is the gray bars for pitch direction discrimination go down. And in this case, down is good. Down means more sensitive. So from age 6 years to about age 18 plus years, which means our convenience sample of undergraduates, pitch perception gets better, which means you have a growing appreciation of melody with age. Okay, so going on. All right, so perception, this perception precedence is actually a good thing. And so there's a really complicated animation here. So this is a kid. So if you had a system where perception and production were sort of locked into each other, it would be really hard to learn. So let's say that you're a child speaker and you see a hopping furry animal and you hear, and you say, wabbit. You hear yourself say it, it goes into your ear, and then you compare that to your mental representation, which is rabbit, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's not what I meant to do. But that error signal, you essentially are getting an error signal, like, ooh, that's not what I meant to say. And that helps you to tune your later productions, like I got to do something different with my mouth to get a different outcome. Similarly, if you're a musician, I'm a clarinetist, had to do that. As with a lot of clarinet depictions in the media, that's the wrong number of keys by a lot. All right, so let's say that you play a sequence of notes, and then you hear that, compare it to your mental representation, and you're like, nope, that's not what I should have said. That's good. You need to notice your errors. I tell this to my grad students as well. Like, I don't worry when you find errors that you've made. I worry when you don't find errors that you've made, because everyone makes errors, and the important part is catching them. Okay, so let's see. Next slide. Okay, so the problem, so here's the reason that you want to have good perception before you get to production. So like if you're a baby, you're hearing a lot of speech before you even start producing any, and that's probably a good thing, because what might happen is that if you hear yourself make the same mistake repeatedly, not only are you using the wrong motor patterns, but you may over time start changing what you think is the perceptually correct pattern so that you keep making the mistake and then you don't even hear yourself making it. But somebody else will totally hear you making this mistake and will be, will react accordingly, right? So just because you don't hear it doesn't mean somebody else doesn't hear it. So this idea that you might, I think as a musician, it's important to realize that it's good to listen to a lot of music before you play it. Might save you some practice time because you know what it's supposed to sound like. You don't have to figure that out. You might enjoy it. You can also, I like to look for ways of being lazy that are also good for me. And so if I can do like listening to music as part of my practice time, that's great. Okay. So how are we doing on time?
You're about done.
Okay. So if you want to flip to the next one. So one thing, so what does that say right there? rock. So it's actually the letter P. But so my point is just that probably we don't have time to do a clapping along exercise, do we?
What's that?
Do we have time to play some melodies and have people clap along in time?
Yeah, like 2 minutes.
All right. So if we could play, thank you so much. Somebody who knows PowerPoint, running the PowerPoint, this is great. So I would like to ask you, so I did an experiment, I've done several experiments, where we play a melody and some of our listeners will hear it with an accompaniment in 6/8 time. Others will hear it with an accompaniment in 3/4 time. So if we could play that first one and clap along when you hear where the beat is. Is it gonna play? Okay, and whoops, maybe we could play the second one just so that you can hear the opposite one. Okay. Gotta end the cadence there. Okay, so then what I did, so some people would hear the first one, other listeners would hear the second one. They would all hear a bunch of different melodies, some 3/4, some 6/8. Okay, then I would play the melody by itself. So if we could play just maybe the top one, the top out of the two bottom ones. That totally made no sense. You're gonna hear a drum beat and tell me how well I want you to tell me how well the drum beat fit. How about a thumbs up if you like it? How many thumbs up? How many thumbs down? Oh, a lot of, okay, so I think we have a primacy effect. Wrap it up. Yeah. We have a primacy effect here, but it actually worked, so you actually preferred the version that you heard first. And that means, what that tells us is just that when you hear music, the way that you heard it before is going to influence how you hear it later. So yet further evidence that you should perceive first and practice later. All right. So, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Check 1, 2. Thank you all very much for your time. Let me just take a second to provide a brief summary of what we've talked about. The first thing I want to emphasize, you've heard the importance of hearing here. It's awfully hard to do anything musical without the ability to hear. So critically important. One of the things that Dr. Torre and I have been trying to do at San Diego State is to provide hearing tests for all music majors annually as a way for you to track your own hearing. My father was an audiologist, and I heard this throughout my entire life, but I wanted to be a rock star, and I didn't listen to him. And I will tell you that I am suffering now with tinnitus, the ringing in the ears, and high-frequency hearing loss because of the amount of noise that I had going into my head early on as I was practicing music. Rock music is one thing, but I'll also tell you that ensemble rehearsals get very loud, depending on where you're sitting. There are really good hearing protection now that's not just muffled foam that you put in your ear. We would like to help you take advantage of the opportunities at San Diego State to protect your hearing throughout the remainder of your studies. So please come talk to us, participate in our studies, and we look forward to helping you. We'd love to take a few questions. We have about 5 minutes if you want to ask a few questions before we move on. And thank you very much for coming before the performances today. Thank you. And we were supposed to have some microphones, I think, here we're going to ask Maestro Gerdes to come out on stage with us for the Q&A here. And if we have microphones, that's great. If not, just speak loud and we'll repeat yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
If you wanted to find you, where could we find you at State?
At San Diego State, my name is Scott Lipscomb. Peter Torre, T-O-R-R-E, is the audiology professor. And then Laura is from University of San Diego, and Dr. Getz is from University of San Diego, and Dr. Creel is from UC San Diego. So, but yes, come talk. I'm in the School of Music and Dance, so come talk to me anytime. All right? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Middle of the room.
I really wanted to learn how to play in tune, so I would use a drone and practice scales against that drone, and for a day or so afterwards, it affected my hearing. Having a sound on one particular pitch, is that a bad thing? Or?
Peter, do you have? Here he comes. Here he comes.
It can be. What you're doing is that frequency range you're exposed to, it's basically a traveling wave in the cochlea, and what happens is it's like, I always sadly say, I lecture on it and say it's like a little rubber ducky sitting on a wave, and after a while that poor little rubber ducky is just getting tired. So what ends up happening is you've worn down the hair cells a little bit, and it's kind of like one of the slides I showed, that if we were to test you right after, there is a decrease we're seeing in some of the musicians after that ensemble practice. The hair cells that are responding to that sound you're exposed to are just worn down. And what happens, the nice part about it, they will come back the next morning or the next day. I guess in time they won't, though. The damage is too pronounced. But what you're doing, I think you're speaking to a specific frequency example, and yeah, what'll happen is that area of the inner ear just gets mad, basically, for being bombarded so much over that period of time.
That's too bad, because that really works out to help play in tune.
Yeah, it does have an effect, yeah, unfortunately.
Yes.
I was just interested, are there like different like hearing loss discrepancies based on what instrument someone might play? Because I myself am a violinist, and not a lot of times when I put my instrument, my left ear is closer to my...
Yeah, you get a proximity effect. So what'll happen is we actually tested somebody who was a violinist, and their left ear had that measure that I was talking about with the function was much poorer than the right ear. Person still had normal hearing, but that underlying function within the cochlea was poor because I can't do both. Maybe I can't. The exposure ear, right? You're really close to the source, and that's the problem. So what you're getting is the reverberation in the sound is bombarding that left ear and possibly damaging those hair cells within the ear. We're looking at position and like who's the musician next to you, because like a flute, for example, the sound is going to come out the end and blast the person on the other side. But for violinists, and we don't know quite yet about brass instruments and things like that, but violinists for sure, we want to know which way you're playing, because that ear down is the one that's going to be more damaged, unfortunately.
All right, another question. Go. Yeah.
This is more like a personal question. How do you guys transition from making music, like as a hobby or something you're interested in, into a profession?
Transitioning from a hobby, being a musician as a hobby, an amateur, more or less, to being a professional. That's really a decision that involves a lot of, that is a very complicated question. That involves a lot of things, from what your goals are as a musician. Do you really want to make your living doing that, which has a whole set of criteria different from just doing it for fun. It also puts you in a situation where, at least at the beginning, there aren't many high-paying entry-level jobs. There are some if you happen to get the bass position with Taylor Swift, but those are very rare. And so the challenge is trying to find a way to make it work. How can I pay my bills playing music? One way to get started, music is actually a lot better to do that than some of the other arts, because you can play with others. You can work with other people, get to know a whole group of people, and you play sometimes as a duo, sometimes a trio, sometimes solo. It allows you a lot of opportunities. But ultimately, it's making that decision. Is this really something that I want to do with my life? And then committing to it. And then learning how to use social media, how to promote yourself, and do all, I mean, marketing and business and management are as important as the musical skills often in getting out there and actually succeeding. So there's a lot involved with it. Yeah, sure. All right, thank you very much for coming. Oh, we got another question. Hold on, one more question. Where?
Yeah, right in the middle.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Why is live music mixed
Did you hear?
Why is live music? Because they want to be rock stars. That's the whole idea. Here's a perfect example. The Instagram page I was telling you about. One of my she's now in graduate school. She was our social media person. She knew a guy in a band, and like she was sitting in the front row and had our dorky sound level meter measuring, and it was at like 95, so even louder than I'm speaking at right now. And he was mad about it. He threw a couple of cool words in and said, we need to be louder. So I don't know, it's something inherent. I don't know, maybe ask Dr. Lipscomb after.
So
He wanted to be a rock star.
I would say, unfortunately, it comes down to the feeling of power, kind of a visceral feeling of power from just the vibration from the music. There's a sense of real strong power is the best way that I can describe it. And that's desirable to some people, but I will tell you that when music is played back loud, 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 what happens is the hearing suffers. So be careful with that. All right, I'll look a little more carefully before I move on this time. Do you see anyone?
I don't see.
All right. Again, thank you so much for coming. You've got two great performing ensembles coming up. Please stick around for the SDSU Symphony Orchestra and Symphonic Band. Thank you. Thank you.